Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Always an Expat, a podcast for British expats in America by British expats in America, dedicated to elevating expat stories, brought to you by fellow British expat, yours truly, Richard Taylor. My guest today is Adam Sandman. Adam is the CEO of Inflectra, which is a leading maker of software that helps customers balance quality and speed, which is a company he founded in 2006. Originally from Swansea, Adam is a Oxford University graduate now living and working in Washington, D.C. So we're going to talk about his journey here, pre-9/11, his experience as an expat slash immigrant and as a business owner, and of course all the usual stuff about our place in the world and what the American dream means to Adam.
Thanks, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
We've not done the boring bit yet, Adam. I got to do the disclaimer. All right, so let me just get the boring bit out of the way. All right, Always an Expat is not a financial podcast. It's a podcast about the expat journey, specifically being a Brit in the US, but it's brought to you by Plan First Wealth. Plan First Wealth is a business that I founded and run today, and we work with successful British expatriates living across the US, people like the ladies and gents who feature on this show. We help them make the most of their opportunity, avoid the expat landmines, and to one day retire happier. Now, with that being said, whilst Plan First Wealth LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor, the views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of Plan First Wealth. Information presented is for educational purposes only. Whew. So without further ado, let's do this. Hi, Adam. Welcome to Always an Expat.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate the opportunity to talk and have a fun discussion today.
Yeah, to reflect. That's what this is about. It's reflecting on the journey. Because in my experience, correct me if I'm wrong, but expats don't do that. They get here, they come here, they're living their life, they're busy. And then when I pop up and say, hey, listen, you've got a story here. And they're like, no, I don't really. I'm like, no, you do. Like, it's maybe it's just me, but these things are interesting.
Well, I think that's very true. I mean, especially coming to the United States, people always ask me, why did I come here? And there's a story about what inspired you to come here. What were what was it that made you make that big journey and change your life? And I've lived here since, as you mentioned, since, my goodness, 1998. I came here, raised a family, 2 kids. So you get into the maelstrom of life and what it throws at you: raising family, starting a business, getting married, doing all these things. And then it's only now that my kids are actually a little bit older and gone to college and they've gone to American universities, and they're now almost at the point. My son is actually almost at the age when I moved to America. It actually has become more of a natural reflection point, in part because he's talking to me about, as an adult now, like, well, what did you do after college? Oh, well, you moved 3,000 miles to the United States. Why did you do that? And he's taken a different path in that he's gone to a university in Maryland, which is our local university, and then he got a job living in Maryland, actually Virginia, working for a defense aerospace company. And so he's taken a very different path. But talking to him and my daughter then, who's gone to California, they did look at going to British universities, but in the end they decided against it. But during that whole conversation, it makes you reflect on, why did I come here in the first place, and what opportunities have they had growing up here that I didn't have growing up here, that I had to then find and forge myself. Just as a simple one is that my son really wanted to get into aerospace and be an aerospace engineer. And growing up in the UK, there is not an aerospace industry. At least I know Richard Branson's been trying hard to launch things out of Cornwall and Virgin Orbit. But really, growing up, if you wanted to be an astronaut or an engineer working on space or certain industries, you really had to leave the country. And so he's had opportunities not to have to do that. He can do so much here in the US. And I can just compare that with growing up in Wales, and where people didn't have those horizons.
That is, if there's one word that captures why people come to the US that's come out of this podcast, it's opportunity. But just, you said something then that has just like jumped right out of me. Wonderful phrase, the maelstrom of life. That is, I feel, you said that and I felt something physical. I am in the maelstrom of life right now. America, kids, young kids, business, really a tricky economic time now. It's always a tricky economic time though, really. But maelstrom of life, that really spoke to me. So normally I'd ask you, tell me about your journey, but before we get there, so your son, who's around your age when you moved here, when he asked you...
Yes, 23, 24.
When he asked you that...
24.
Okay, we will edit that out, so don't tell Mum. What did he say? What did he say when you started having that conversation? How did that conversation go?
Well, the story is an interesting one because so I moved here so I will tell my journey a little bit because it's relevant. I moved here in '98 after coming for a summer in 1997, and this was a time when anyone who was working in the IT industry really had a lot of opportunities in America and a much more favorable visa environment than we have today. So this is back in the Clinton era. There was the millennium bug when computers were going to stop working because of the last two digits in the year, and anyone who knew anything about computers could find a job in America, and there were plentiful visas. And I think the country really was looking for people to move from Ireland and the UK and other countries to the United States to work in IT. So that happened. I moved here. I got a job working for a company in Boston called Sapient. Big shout out to them because they really gave me my first chance here in America, sponsored my visa. And it was around that time that I met my wife. And for a variety of reasons, we had kids very early. Like within a year of moving here, I already had
Oh, no way.
kids on the way. So at the age that my son is now, I actually was about to have him, or my wife was having him, but
Wow.
he was about to be
Okay.
born. So the conversation we had at last year was, wow, how did you do that? Because he's like,
Yeah.
I'm 24. I can't imagine having a young child at my age. I'm just finishing university. I've been out a year. My first job. I've got an apartment, a girlfriend, and doing these things. I can't imagine what you had to go through. I'm like, yeah. Looking back, I don't know how I did. It was a lot of work. It was the true maelstrom.
Yeah. Yeah, that's you had a lot going on at a young age, and I imagine. Look, I'm sure you got a salary bump coming over here, but I'm just
Right.
guessing here. Probably wasn't a huge amount of money coming into the household. 23, 24, new to America, right?
Right, right. My wife, luckily, my wife had a good job, and we both made about the same. But and that's true. It's interesting. Growing up in Great Britain and going to university, when I left university, looking at the salaries in the UK, they probably still are. I don't haven't looked, but they're double. They were double in the United States. A software
Mm.
engineer back in '98 could make $42,000 a year. A software engineer at a top tier consulting firm like an Accenture, although it was called Anderson Consulting then, would make £20,000 a year. And so, I mean, I know there's the currency conversion, but the cost of living and the purchasing power of the dollar and the pound back then were about almost 1 to 1 in many ways. Cost of living was cheaper in America then. And I think coming here, that felt like a huge amount of money. Then once you have a kid, you suddenly realize that's not a lot of money at all. That the rent, you've gone from a one bedroom, which you can comfortably afford, to a two or three bedroom, and you're renting and all the rest of it. And America does have its hidden expenses like the health insurance costs,
Yeah.
particularly when you've got a family rather than an individual. And as an individual, 23-year-old, 24-year-old, you're probably not using healthcare a lot. Once you've got a baby, you're going to the doctor
Yeah.
every month with pink eye and amoxicillin and all the stuff you need to do and all that fun
And
stuff.
you're coming with a baby. Not only comes with costs, but it comes with obligations, responsibilities. You have to duck out of work to go to take them to doctor with a pink eye or whatever.
Yeah,
This,
yeah,
and
yeah, yes.
you're a new employee, presumably. You're on a
Yep,
visa. So
yep,
you're in a
H1B, yep.
precarious-ish position, right? And I mean, look, right, so looking back now, do you look back at that? That was tough, or was it? I mean, how do you
Oh my
reflect on
God, I'm
that?
terrified thinking about it. At the time, it was a little terrifying because I was on a visa, but then luckily I got a green card because my wife is born in America, so that took away the visa, I guess, stress. But we moved to California within a year, which is a lot more expensive again. And then we had the 2000 downturn in the tech industry, and now there were layoffs at the company I was working for, still Sapient. Many clients were deserting. A lot of dot-coms collapsed. And now we had a kid, and my wife was not working anymore because when we moved to California, uh, basically her job was in Boston, not in California, and we were looking for her to get a job, and all this stuff was happening in life. And America is a great place to have opportunity to make money. It's a more challenging environment, I think, than the UK. A lot of people coming from the UK, I think, have this feeling that the government is there to look after them. And
Mm.
you see this in the news when you read about a natural disaster or anything happening. There's this feeling that why didn't the government prevent that? In America, I think the feeling is the government's there, but its not job is not to protect you for everything. You are much more on your own, and that's why people come here and like that in general. But it is a very different cultural basis, and I think Britain is a lot closer to Europe in that regard than it might think it is. And especially as an expat, when you come here as a British person, the language is familiar, but culturally it's much more alien than it's going to, say, France or Spain or Germany, where the language is different, but the culture, I think,
Yeah, I agree.
philosophically is more aligned.
I
So
agree with you.
it was hard living through that experience of going from a single person where you have a decent salary, coming from Britain, going, wow, this is a great opportunity, to like life throws everything at you at once, and you're like, oh, downturn the economy, family, move to a more expensive city, we don't know anyone in a country you don't know anyone. But it all worked out. I mean, that's why we ended up in the Washington D.C. area, because luckily a project I was working on got the opportunity to move to D.C. My wife could get a job in D.C. She's done very well here. We both found the cost of living ironically lower in D.C. than in California, and so within 2 or 3 years, I think our family had stabilized, work had stabilized. But you're right, it was still difficult trying to find time off to do the family things. America is not always as easy at that. Like my wife had no paid maternity leave. I had paid paternity leave. Isn't that crazy?
Well, Adam, do you know what? Let's just go back to what you just said about the cultural differences, and I think I think you bang on the money with that, and I feel the same way. And I think people come here and love it until they need it, or until they realise it's not there, and then you feel an exposure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your left flank is exposed in a way that I don't think you would if you were in the UK or Europe, where there's a bit more support. That can be a bit of a scary feeling. So 2 young kids, our childcare bill is astronomical, terrifyingly so. I've got a good friend who lives in Berlin. His kid, you've got a kid the same age. His kid is the state has great childcare, completely free up to a certain age. So all these costs that my wife and I are incurring, and and then there's always costs on top of costs. He doesn't have any of that, and we're doing fine. But you're just aware of it every month. When I tally my own books, you're like, oh, this is a lot, and there's no one there. There is no support system.
There's no
It's
backstop.
us.
There's no institutional backstop. No, it's interesting. In California, that time when we were in California, we made good friends with a Norwegian couple. He was American, and she was Norwegian, and we moved back. We moved to Washington because of again work brought us here, and economically it was a very good move for us. They actually moved back to Norway because they had the same problem. Is that he was working actually as a limousine driver in LA, which makes good money. It's the hours are terrible, so it was hard for him to be a father. And we both had a 2-year-old at the time. My son was 2, my goodness, and their daughter was 2, and they moved back to Norway, where those salaries are much lower in Oslo. There's a whole state infrastructure there for childcare and family. There's much more paid time off, and I think he ended up making cheese and becoming an artisanal
Really?
cheesemaker.
Oh
And
wow.
then she went back to work in IT, so they both were able to work. We visited them once, and they had this not like a commune, but the apartment building they were at, everyone knew each other, and it was a very communal living. America is more of an individualistic culture. And again, there's pros and cons to everything, but I think you have
Completely.
to expect that and understand that.
Well, yeah, and I don't think I did. No, I think I did logically. I don't think I did
Intellectually.
intellectually. Yeah, but I don't think I did. I don't think I did emotionally, and I didn't understand how important that is for me because um, uh, you, you, I understand the argument. Why should I pay for your kids? I understand that. I get it, right? But I also enjoy being part of a society, and I think the European approach engenders a better society. So I get both sides, and to your point, there's good and bad, and I'm here, right? But part of this part of this podcast, right, is about reflecting on these things, lessons learned, so that people coming here, because I hope this
Hmm.
podcast is picked up by people who are coming here, people can come better armed. Mentally for they speak our language and I feel like I know the US because I've seen it on the movies. It ain't the same, and rather than me having to butt up against that for a few years before you kind of let yourself relax into your journey here would be smoother.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that. So people always ask me, "Why did you come here?" And I reflect back and think, well, I used to watch maybe dating me now, the 80s, the A Team and Knight Rider, and a lot of 1980s American television shows that it kind of glamorized America. And then now that I've looked back at the shows, in many cases they're all filmed in Southern California, of course.
Yeah.
Um, which is where my daughter's at college. And she's working. At University of Southern California doing film and media and business and tech, and she gets to go on film shoots and stuff. So she's living the life that I was
Nice.
probably watching, ironically. So it's kind of fun. But that's what inspires you. Come here, and America is a great place to build a company. So I would say I'd always wanted to build a company. That was something I'd wanted to do even when living in Britain. My parents will always remember that we were driving on the Chiswick flyover in West London, that big concrete monstrosity that enters West London from Wales, and you see all these skyscrapers with international companies' names lit up. And I always remember thinking, like, I would have found a company like that with a skyscraper with the company's names on it. And I always felt that America was the place to do that. And I would still say that's true. If you want to start a technology company, America is the place to do it. And it's an unfair advantage. So I've talked to companies that are European software companies and people from South America and other countries, and they would say, if you start a small software company in America, you have an unfair advantage because Americans will buy from you because you're American, and other countries will buy from you because you're American. But if
Ah,
you're a European software company headquartered in Europe and you try and sell to America, they'll completely ignore you because you're obviously not the latest tech. And so you have a much bigger advantage. So I do think if you want to make it big in America, it is a great place to come. And I think the aspirations are bigger. When people ask me in Britain how the company's doing, I'll say we're doing X million, and they'll say, "Oh my goodness, you're doing X million. That's so amazing. I wish I could do that." In America, they'll be like, "Oh, that's great, buddy. How are you going to get to the next million? When are you
yeah.
going to get your next X? What's your growth plan?" That's the
Adam,
different mindset.
Adam, the numbers here are just unbelievably different. Do you know, I remember
Yes.
this is not that long ago reading an article where it talked about this is before Rishi was prime minister. Obviously, it
Okay.
must have been before he was in the cabinet. Must be because it talked about the richest man in the cabinet being Jeremy Hunt having a
Yes.
net worth of £14 million, and you're like, in America, that
There's like
wouldn't
two
even
zeros on
register.
that at least. Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't even register. The numbers are just so much bigger. You know something else I heard recently? I hadn't thought about this, and you can tell me if this bears true for your experience or not. It's about regulation and
Hmm.
the different approaches to regulation. They're saying in America, it's kind of like let it happen, and then once it's been going on for a while, we'll work out how to regulate it. What's good, what's bad. Whereas in Europe, it's more preemptive. They
Oh,
try and
100%. You're 100% right. Yeah, I would say the European approach is let's try and regulate it before it happens, and then
yeah,
often stifle it. Britain tends
yes.
to err more in that regard, at least post Thatcher. And that, don't want to get too into politics, but I think Britain has become more European, ironically, despite fighting Europe to become not in Europe. But whereas in America, I would say the regulators either do what you say or do nothing and say, well, the lawyers will catch it with a class action suit later.
Oh.
A lot of times there are regulations here. But they rely on the fact that if it's a major harm, there'll be a class action suit. So a lot of companies will in-house police and self-regulate just to avoid lawsuits, which isn't necessarily a good thing. I'm not advocating that, but that does seem to be the approach here.
So, another thing I've said this on this podcast before, but another thing that I enjoy repeating, I've heard another podcasters refer to America as a business, Europe is a museum, and Japan is a nursing home. And I really like. Obviously, that's a huge broad strokes, but I like it. I'm like okay, and I get it, and I can buy into it. If someone asks you to explain the difference, and I love both. All right, America is a land of opportunity, but Europe's amazing. I do miss Europe a lot.
Well, one of the things I've been very lucky is with my business, and this is something that I guess if you start a company in America, you have the option of making an international business. So my business is international. In fact, we do I think 50% of our business outside the US, maybe even 55%, and a
Wow.
large part of that is Europe. And also we do some stuff in South America and East Asia and Australia. And Australia is weird because you go to Australia, and that's almost like a sort of a mini America. Just to diverge for a second, because Australia is a bunch of British expats who went to a different continent, but it's much more British than America is. Um, I've got an interesting observation of Sydney, which was fascinating, and Melbourne. But to answer the question about Europe, you can also get the benefits of going to Europe and visiting and being part of that cultural rich tapestry, and still come from America. And we have employees in Europe now. We have customers there and partners there. So I get to go back quite a bit. I was in Berlin about 2 weeks ago, and it is a fantastic city. And there are some pockets of innovation, like Berlin specific, not Germany as a whole. Germany is much more statist, but Berlin is much more entrepreneurial. And so there are pockets of innovation. Parts of northern Italy, Ireland is quite different actually. Ireland's more like America. So I would say Europe's not entirely a museum. It's a museum with some gift shops,
Mm.
maybe, or small pop-up businesses in the museum, which are sort of trying to challenge the orthodoxy.
London's getting quite a reputation though on the tech scene, isn't it? For AI and stuff.
Yeah, London. I don't know. I'm
Maybe
always think London's trying to be a bit more. I don't know. With Brexit, London lost a lot of its talent because a lot of the talent was East European people who came to London to start companies, and they've gone back to Poland. They've gone to other countries in Ireland. I don't know. I think London is not as innovative as it was before Brexit.
Really?
I would say. I feel, despite what the government's trying to do, I feel like a lot of the tech there is American tech or other tech. It's not. There's a lot of fintech, but a lot of the pure startup stuff seems to have gone to Ireland and Berlin.
Yeah,
I
Ireland's
don't know if
winning,
I would
isn't it?
agree. Yeah,
Ireland's
Ireland.
winning.
I mean, I was in Dublin, and the like it was in London, the bartenders are all Polish, and all the entrepreneurs, the people you meet in the cafes, they're often from East Europe because they've got the visa. They're in the European Union and free movement,
Yep.
and so I think Ireland is a very dynamic place to be. And London's lost a little bit of the race. I think it's still London can still make it up, but I wouldn't say London's as quite as happening as it was maybe 5 years ago.
Tell us
Sadly.
your. Sadly, I agree. Tell us your Sydney observation.
So Sydney is interesting. So we went there because we have quite a few customers there, and there's a lot of British people there. When you go to Sydney, particularly in the IT industry, they're almost all expat Brits and almost all first generation. So people like you and I think, who moved there. Whereas in America, that's a little bit less common. So everyone seemed to be from Manchester or from London or other places. But Sydney is like this, and Australia had particularly Sydney had this feel of like, imagine California, because the weather's like California. There's beaches. Imagine America had lost the war of independence, and Britain had won. So let's say at Yorktown, General Wallace had won, and the Americans had surrendered. I think Sydney felt a lot like LA or New York if that had happened. It's very American in some ways, and yet so British in others, that it was this really weird mix. But it felt like a lot of my time in Australia felt like, wow, it's like this uncanny valley. It's not a very different country. Like when you go to France or Germany, it feels very different. There's a long culture there, and you feel like you're not in Britain. Parts of Australia, I really felt like it's like America if Britain still controlled it, and it was just really weird. My daughter came with me, and she said the same thing. It was almost more disconcerting than going to another country because it was so similar in some ways and so different in other ways that it was fascinating. Especially her growing up in America, she said she felt like it was this weird American-British hybrid, and that's what it felt like. As if America had lost the war of independence, America would all be like Australia.
Do you know what? I have never given that any thought. I've just never given that counterfactual any thought. Had America had the French fleet? Because the French fleet sailed up and boxed in Cornwallis, right, at Yorktown. That
Yeah,
sort of thing.
yeah, right.
How
Well, the
did they
French helped
not?
America out, right?
Yeah,
If France hadn't intervened, we probably would have. We, American citizen, would
yeah,
have
yeah.
lost the war against my British citizenship.
And yet,
Um, and
we get all the
yeah,
credit right now. And they love
right.
we us Brits get away with murder here. But
Yeah,
I've never
the
given.
French they were the oldest ally, but that's no, you're absolutely right.
No, no,
That's
no,
true.
totally. The French are the oldest ally, but I'm not sure how many Americans truly remember that.
That is true.
Other than there's a street or a square in every town named Lafayette, which
Yeah,
is
Lafayette
it's a
Square,
nice
exactly.
start, right?
Hmm.
But the British definitely get more credit here than they are due or deserve, and I'll happily take it. I enjoy it.
Hmm. Yeah, because if you go to Australia, I mean, like America, it's a East Coast, West Coast. It's got most people live on the coast. It's got a very large interior, which is more rural. And America, if you created a movie of an alternate universe like in Star Trek, where the British had won, in some ways it would not be that different. You still have probably the same
Yeah.
agriculture. You sell a lot of the same farm. They would have moved west. Probably the border with Canada would be different. I imagine large parts of Mexico would control the southern part because I think Britain wouldn't have been involved with the Mexican American wars in the way they evolved. But in many ways,
I wonder if it would be as
yeah,
fiercely independent. You know how going back to that individualism before we talked
yeah,
about and America being so fiercely independent and so fiercely behind free. Let's not get behind what they mean by freedom, but let's just that whole
right,
notion
right,
of it.
right.
That I think it would be presumably similar to what it is today, but
Because
with but
Australia
major
has that.
differences.
Yeah, if you
Yeah,
go to Australia, people have that. Like, I want my yard, my ute. I want my back. I want my space. There's definitely an independent living, libertarian streak in Australia, which I don't see as much in Canada. I've only been to Canada a few times, so I don't want to generalize to people in the north. So apologies. But it does. So I think some of that would still be the same. But you're right; it would be a very different tone. It wouldn't be. It would have been in the Commonwealth. It would, and the border with Canada would have been much more porous. Maybe it would have been one country because
yeah.
Canada was basically people who left the United States to a loyalist. So maybe we would have a country that would be all of Canada and 2/3 of North America, and then Mexico would be much larger and take up a lot of the southern part. Anyway,
Well,
it's
yeah, no, no.
interesting.
I hope this is a complete tangent, but presumably also the French wouldn't have sold. The Louisiana
Louisiana,
Purchase wouldn't have happened, right?
right?
So
True,
so
true.
that might be a different country, and yeah, Mexico would still most of
California, New
California and New
Mexico,
Mexico.
yeah, and Texas too.
Counterfactuals. Yeah, you shouldn't doing them, but they're still fascinating. I'd never given that any thought. I don't know why. I'd never given that any thought, and I hadn't thought about how these two places could have been Australia and similar paths, but different.
Different roads taken. Have you been to
Yeah,
Australia?
I have, but many years ago when I was in my early 20s, so I wasn't really thinking about these things. I was just thinking about where can I get what's a little beer called? A schooner?
Oh, I don't know, but maybe.
S-
Yeah.
They have like a little mini beer. I can't remember. It goes with an S. We partook in many of those when I was there. I'd love. I am looking forward to going back. Partly because of
Sydney
Bluey.
was great.
Yeah, Sydney's a wonderful. Have you come across Bluey?
Bluey? What's Bluey?
Bluey is the best kids cartoon ever. And I know parents listening to this will be nodding away, and everyone else will be going, "What is he talking about?" Bluey is an Australian cartoon. It's a dingo, the dingo family, and it's based in Australia, and kids love it, but
In
adults love
America
it.
or Britain? Is it big? Is it big in the
You know,
US?
it's big in the US. It's big in the UK.
Wow.
I don't know. It's big in Australia, obviously. I don't know if it's big elsewhere, but it's genuinely moving. It's a wonder. We have Disney Plus. I don't think we would have Disney Plus if we didn't have kids, and I cannot tell you how much I love Disney Plus. All these movies that they put out, all these programs, but mainly the movies. You watch. So obviously, you watch Toy Story 1, Toy Story 2. They were good movies. I remember watching them in the cinema.
Yeah,
But they're just good stories. Toy Story 3 and 4, if you don't shed a tear at the end of Toy Story 3 and 4, there's something wrong with you. There's lessons, they're moving, there's adult jokes, but and all these films on there, they're a joy to watch for adults as well.
Well, I think that they cracked the code on that. I haven't seen the latest two, but I think in general the movies that do well now are the ones that adults want to can bear to sit through. And even
Yes,
things, even the older ones in the 80s and 90s, there was an adult theme that you completely missed. And
of
when you watch it
course.
now, you go,
Yeah.
now I see what they was on about.
Of course, but
Yeah.
the standard of these, there's one called Elemental out now, which is also look. I
Oh, I
can't
know
just
that
rattle
one.
them
Yeah.
off. There's so many, they're just great, but that was confined to movies, whereas this kids show, because we're all, Peppa Pig, and there's some other ones which are just
Teletubbies
unbearable.
or
Yeah, just unbearable. Whereas Bluey it's a joy to watch as an adult, I didn't think I'd ever be saying that.
my kids now because too old for all that. But when they were growing up, we used to watch. Back in the day, we didn't have cable, so we did PBS Kids, and that was where they got most of the television. So things like Arthur and oh my goodness, Dinosaur, Dragon Tales, and Dinosaur Train, all these things that I can't remember. And actually, when I started the business, I actually would use those blocks of time to get work done. So I'm like, okay, let's put on Arthur and Dragon Tales. Okay, I've got half an hour to write some code, start the business, working on it, and then they would get bored and like, okay, let's go to the park or something.
Well, look, we've talked about that previously, right? Like you set this business up, and you kind of in the early days, didn't you? Kind of you needed flexible working, parenting, and I'm
Right.
living that now. I'm finding you kind of have to fit work in where you can.
Right. And what you said at the beginning about the cost of childcare was a factor. So to go back to the story a little bit was that I was working at Sapient. That was the company that brought me, helped me get over here with a visa and everything. Worked in LA, worked in DC, and then around 2006 when I started the company, we had two kids now. One was, oh my God, terrible with ages, 2 or 3, and my daughter now, my son was now 6 or 7, and we had to have pre-care to get because the primary school, the elementary school, I'm trying to use both words, it didn't start early enough for me to get to my job. So we had to go to get a pre-care, go to my job, and then my daughter was in a full-time daycare, so we could both work. And it was costing a fortune, long commutes, because this was before working from home, because we were still using, I think, dial-up internet, or certainly DSL was around. But the idea of working remotely didn't exist, so we were commuting in person 5 days a week, and we're in Washington, D.C., so we got to commute from the suburbs into the city. I remember doing this, and by the time we get to 2005, 2006, we're almost done. We're burnt out. It's driving us mad. There's no time. Our exhaustion factor is increasing. Our family doesn't live nearby because we're expats. Although I'm from Britain, she's from California, so her family's all in the West Coast. So it was just the two of us. There was no grandparents. There were friends, but everyone's got their own young kids. And that's when I decided to start the company. And actually, one of the big things is I said we can cut the daycare, cut the before care. They can go to public school, which is free, and we'll use the savings to start the company. And I'll work in the evenings, and I'll work in the nap times and in the Disney Plus, or in this case, it was PBS Kids time, and that's what we did. So we actually got a savings in cash terms for not paying all these outlays, and that's where that's one of the benefits of being in a suburb was that the public schools are decent, and that's public school in the American sense, a state school. So that way, and I think that's one of the things you have to be very careful of is there's a huge hidden cost if you have to go to private education, and so when you're looking at moving to a city in America, it's worth looking at the public schools, because if they're good, and in Washington D.C. it's a real mix. In the city of Washington, they're terrible. In the Maryland and Virginia suburbs, they're some of the best in the country. And you can literally there are some streets in Washington which are crazy because of the way the city's built. That on one side of the same road, you're in Maryland, free
Yep.
public schools, best in the
Yep.
world, win national medals. The other side of the same street, other side of the road, they're in
Yep.
D.C. and you have to go private.
Yeah, we've got a similar situation where I am between New York and
Yeah.
I'm right by the state line between New York and Connecticut, and we have
Okay.
one
Yeah.
road
Same
where
thing.
it's
Exactly.
one
Right.
side of Connecticut, one side Greenwich, one of the wealthiest towns in America, and the other side Portchester, which is a great town, but it's not one of the the hedge funders don't flock there. Put it that way.
Right, right. And so you have to factor in the house price versus the cost of childcare versus the cost of school. And so there's those triaging those factors is a big thing. And if you're coming, to the country and looking to make a home here, you have to factor that in. And I was someone who didn't really want to live in a suburb. I want to live in the city and be cool and hip. And then
I miss
you got
it.
kids, you're like,
Yeah.
hip
Yeah,
and
totally.
happening can wait 20 years. I got to pay the bills.
Yeah, totally. You know what you just talked about. My wife was in New York yesterday. Now, luckily, this is the work from home era, and
Right.
I live a mile from my house. I've got an office here where I am, but I can also work from home easily. My wife works from home most days, but she's in New York occasionally. She was in New York yesterday. One day.
Right.
It's exhausting because then I have to do more of the childcare in the morning. She has to get up even
Yep.
early to get the train. She makes the train by 1 minute. If she doesn't, she's late for a first meeting. She then gets back. When she got back, we're doing the. I happened to the first kid was up a bit later. The youngest one, she came in just as I was putting them both, the youngest one down. So she happened to see them, but if she hadn't, she wouldn't have seen the youngest. She was knackered. Doing that every day, which is what everyone did for years.
Yes,
Young
that's why
family.
in 2006 I started the company.
No,
So starting a
totally.
company was like, oh my God, it's so relaxing. So I remember the very first few weeks, it was like, okay, I had a little desk in my room, my bedroom. My wife would go off to work commuting. She'd bike to the metro station and be off. She works for the government, so she'd be off doing that. And I said, okay, I get out of my bed, put my laptop on. My daughter was, I think, downstairs sleeping, or maybe at that point, or she'd woken up and I was feeding her, or whatever. We did all that, and then she'd watch some TV, and I'm on get out of bed, sit on my laptop, and go, click around. I'm like, oh wow, that's so easy. And then and then when she was older, went to school. They'd come back on the school bus, and I could be there. Wow, this is so easy. Versus a month before, where we literally, like yourself, you missed the train by 1 minute because you got to connect. We were taking them on the train in a buggy / stroller to daycare. And then I remember doing a conference call once on. We didn't have I think we had one. I didn't have a cell phone yet at this point, 2006. So I was doing this on a payphone. I'm on a payphone, dialing into a
my
conference
God.
call from outside the daycare in the Federal Aviation Administration's in-house daycare. There's a payphone, and it's like a movie where some guy's on the phone like, "Get off that phone! I need it right now. I'm gonna make a sales call."
It's like imagine doing that for 10 years.
Don't need
15.
to imagine it.
Just-
Well, I did it for 5 years.
Yeah.
Oh, more, yeah.
But that will do you in. That will do you in. That's no quality of life. Because some people
Right.
are trapped doing that, and that's pretty
Yep.
brutal.
I think that is part of the American experience. Is that America is a great place, but it can also be a very confining in that sense, economically confining. It's not confining in terms of the topography or the opportunities,
Yeah.
but you can end up getting trapped in place in that kind of economic
hamster
cycle
wheel.
where you can't get out of. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Ooh, exhausting. Well, we've benefited from work from home, so because we were kind of at a breaking point when the pandemic happened, and at first you're kind of terrified of what the pandemic means, but for us, for a young family, it's been great. For someone coming into the workforce, that's a challenge. Not being around fellow professionals. I don't know how you learn, but there is no one size fits all. There's no one answer to this now. It's just the world is different, and we should find a way to make this work for everyone to the extent that you can.
Right, and that's interesting. You raise a very interesting point because one of the side things I now do, which I didn't do because I didn't have time, but I do now, is I'm actually on the committee of our local alumni group. So it's for the Oxford University Society of DC. It's a great group. We have members, and the members span from people who are in their 70s and 80s who've lived here for many years. And we also get people who are literally coming into the UK for the first time, from the UK for the first time. Now, most people who are coming to DC, I would say I was more of an exception, but nowadays most people coming to DC from a UK university typically are working for one of the World Bank, IMF institutions or sub-institutions or the IADB. They're working for basically an international think tank or agency that is based in DC, because that's usually the easiest way to come to the US. And that's a little bit easier, I think, than if you came on your own, because these institutions have infrastructure, they have healthcare, and you may only be here for 3 to 6 years and then you go back. So I think that's not the full expat experience. It's a little bit of a bubble you get in that environment. But what I would say is very interesting is that before the pandemic, when people came to the alumni group, they had social networks because they would come to the World Bank. There maybe 10 of the people had come that year from, say, Oxford, and 10 from Cambridge, and a bunch from other universities. And they'd arrive there, they'd meet other 20-year-olds, and it was their first time in the city. Within 6 months, they knew a bunch of people, and they would have activities in friend groups. Because they're now working from home, or even if they're not, everyone else is. Like, World Bank's half empty, if not mostly empty. They don't know anyone, and they may have been here for 6 months, and they've not met a single person in person from work. So how do you build a social network? And so the ironic thing is the alumni association has become a lot more important. So I think in the past we do these happy hours, and we get like six people would come, and usually what would happen is you get a few 20-year-olds who just come, and then you have all the people who have kids like I was who don't go because they're busy, and then you have all the people who are in their 50s and 60s. So then the people in their 60s and 70s and 50s, their kids are grown like mine, and we're like, oh, now's the time to reconnect with my alumni. I've got time. Yes, happy hours. Yay, I'll come in for the day. Yeah. And so there was these two spikes of membership, but that early spike was much smaller. It was more people who were later stages of career. They enjoy, especially because if they're Americans, they would love to connect with Oxford, and we'd have people coming in. It was a way to reconnect with their earlier parts of their life. But now it's become a lot more important for the young people. We've had much higher attendance and membership of the happy hours than ever before, because a lot of people in their 20s, they see it as a way to meet people in DC, and there are people who actually work at the same job and same organization, and the only time they've seen each other is when they come to our happy hour. They're both at the World Bank. They're both from Britain, and they've only met now. So that's so crazy.
That's super interesting. Just think, so Swansea to Oxford to DC. And I know there's a detour to California in there as well, but basically Swansea to Oxford to DC. That's to the CEO of what is now, right, a rapidly growing business there's not funding, self-funding. Like this is quite a journey.
Yeah, that's true. But you never, like, being a naturalized American, we don't look back on those things. We're thinking of the next. I'm thinking of the next thing. Like, how do we get to the next level? Because you're right. I think a British person would look back, and that's our culture. I do think I've become very American. And my family would say, my family in the UK would say, I was always that way, and that's why I came. And my wife even says, she's born in the US, she goes, you're more American than anyone I know who's been born here. I think that's true. You come here for an opportunity, and you came here for that reason, and so you embody the spirit of the country you've taken on. I mean, I chose to come here as opposed to just being born here, and I think my kids are sometimes a reaction to that. They're like, Dad, oh, come on, Dad, you don't have to worry about business. No, we've got to do this. We've got to make a difference here, change the world. That's the American way, right?
I think that realization is missing. Without trying to get too political, but immigration is a hot topic, and there is a lot of anti-immigration. I know there's a problem with the southern border. I know that, but there is a lot of anti-immigration because Americans think people coming in won't be American, and what they don't realize is that a lot of people coming in buy into America, and even if they don't, when they've been here for a while and they make it, they will do, and will become, in many ways, more American. They'll uphold the values and fight for it. In some ways,
I think you're 100% right. Most people I've known who are not, and quite a few in DC, people that we socialize with, have come from other countries, European countries, South America, and they're all more American than most Americans. They're more capitalist, more libertarian, more free market than most people who are born here. Most people who are born here, and at least in the Washington area, which is more Democrat, like, oh yeah, more socialist, we should be more like Europe, and they're like, no, no way. So it's interesting. You're right. You're absolutely right. And maybe it's our perspective coming here, but I do think that's a misguided trope that immigrants want to turn America into where they came from. Then if that was the case, why did they leave? I don't think so.
No, not at all. But do you go back to Wales and Swansea much?
I go back to the UK once a year. We've got some customer interest, and I try and balance, visiting my family lives in a mixture of places. My sister's in Manchester, my parents are in Wales with their friends, and then my aunt's in London. So I must admit, I try and centralize my trip in London as much as possible, mainly because after a 7 or 8 hour flight, it's a bit of a hassle to go 4 hours to Wales. And then I haven't got a car, and it's London I can get around more easily without a car, whereas in Wales, they have to drive me everywhere. So I must admit, I try and centralize in London. I might go to Manchester, and then I'll try and do a side trip. Like every other time, I might go to Wales or Manchester as well. But so I definitely get back to the UK, and I've also tried meeting them in Europe sometimes. So I was in Berlin and Frankfurt a few years ago, and
What a
we would
great
meet up there. And
excuse. Yeah.
yeah,
What a great
well,
reason.
exactly. So and they like to come there too. So I think
Yeah.
luckily my parents are at the age where they can still travel
Uh-huh.
internationally, both within Europe and to the US. When that happens less, I imagine I'll have to go more to Wales than just to the other places.
Do you know, just thinking about what we just said about Americans and expats coming in, and the other thing is, what one I mean, I'm terribly guilty of always thinking the grass is greener. But one thing I realise having moved away is how much I took for granted. Whether it's just like pubs, or whether it's things like democracy, right? Realising how
Yes.
fragile it is. And I think
Hmm.
one thing, so assuming human nature is universal, I bet there's oodles of Americans who also take a lot about being American totally for granted, whereas we come in and maybe not taking it so for granted. And I think that influx of like fresh awe, it might be the wrong word, but you know what I mean, like fresh reverence for these things. Like you're in DC, you can't go to DC and not be in awe of the
Oh, for
stuff.
sure. I mean, you look at the founding fathers and what they built out of nothing, and well, DC was a city that was literally built out of a
Swamp.
swamp
Yeah.
to unify a north-south divide at that time. Right, and they took huge personal risks. And you look at some of the people who built these. I don't know the infrastructure that we take for granted here. I mean, what Europe did over thousands of years, they was done here in maybe 200 years. I mean, if you think about it, so that's incredible. And if you look at China, I mean, without getting political, China's done the same thing. They've in 50 years done what maybe we did in 150, what Europe did in 500 to 1,000. So we kind of technology is speeding up anyway. But I do think that's true. People who were born here and lived here their entire lives take it for granted. In the same way that I think people in Britain, I'm sure, take the National Health Service for granted, and they're always complaining about it, and transport and trains and things in America are not always perfect. There are things that, like particularly transport outside of air travel and cars, is weak. And people are always moaning in Britain about the trains, but if they came here, they would realize you can at least take a train somewhere, which you can't here.
Yeah.
So I suppose we always take for granted where we came from. I mean, it's just natural. And I think you're right, though. People who come to America do have that fresh perspective of why they came and what they want to do.
Yeah. NHS though, my dad told me a story of a relative who's had a heart attack and was left like in the hall on a bed for like hours because there's just no, like
I've
it
heard
sounds
that.
like that they are
COVID, I think, really took it down a
collapsing.
notch. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's true. My mother said that she was told if she has a heart attack, she did, but she was told anecdotally that take a bus, don't wait for an ambulance.
yeah, yeah.
At
I
least
mean,
there are buses.
yeah, right. I don't want to get a bus. Um, yeah, it's one of those things that conflicts me because I believe in universal healthcare. I don't believe I don't believe it's a human right as often is said, but I believe it should be provided by the state. But then at the same time, if you said to me where would you rather get sick, I'm like America, please.
Right, right. If you have insurance, right. And actually, one of the things that my company is, and one of the things I've tried to do, and I started the company. One of the reasons, so you mentioned earlier on, I didn't take any funding. One reason is at the beginning of days, it was a lifestyle company, back to the whole bouncing family and so on. But as we got bigger, and we moved into more of a growth model when the kids were older, I didn't take money partly because if you look at some of these private equity companies, and without getting into the pros and cons of the different industries, um, oftentimes there's this herd mentality that forces companies to make short-term decisions which aren't necessarily good for the long term. One of the benefits of having
Uh huh.
ownership of the company has been doing things that you believe is right. And I've always tried to say we have an American work ethic combined with a European sensibility in some
Yeah.
ways. So we have a great healthcare plan for all employees. We have more days off than you would typically have in an American company, and we try and also when I started the company, one of the things was to build a company that was more flexible for young families, having face that struggle and trying to find a way to make that economically sustainable for the company and for the individual. And we have done that. We have a lot of part-time people, and we've always had a flexible culture. And if someone's sick, don't work that day, and don't try and work half work. And so I've tried to bring, I would say, the best of Europe and the best of America together in starting the company. And if you look at some of the early business owners, like the Hershey family, and some of the early companies that started in America, they were often expats from the UK who were often Quakers or had religious leanings that actually they built companies that were not just to make money, that were to actually. So the American capitalism of that era is quite different to today. And it was much more of a society capitalism. And so when you talk about this division between, the progressive left and the right and the capitalism versus free market versus progressive government intervention. I think capitalism itself was a very different beast in those early days of the American Republic. It sounds like an academic lecture. And I think if American business wants to regain the trust of the public, and I think as business owners and entrepreneurs, we have that responsibility. Looking back at some of what they did is worthwhile, because I think you take the best of American capitalism, but you also take a look back at how you can make sure your communities and your workers are taken care of. If you're looking 5 years out rather than 1 quarter out, you do that. So I think we can get the best of an American and European approach, and people who come as immigrants may be the right people to do that, because if you've come from Britain and you move to America, for example, you've enjoyed the benefits of the European/British system. You come to America, found a company. Can you build a world-class entrepreneurial company that still treats workers as people? And I think the answer is yes. And I think we are the people to do it.
Well, Adam, it's funny you mention all that, because we're running a similar experiment here. So we have European style holidays. Much more generous allowance. It's growing. We have a much more European style parental leave. We have a much more European approach to sick leave. If you're sick, don't come in. You don't have to use sick days or holidays for it. We're going to trust you because you're grown up and adults. And I guess you can be open to abuse, but then every system's open to abuse. But there are times when you're like, wait, I'm paying American salaries, which are, as we talked about before, way higher, and European benefits. It's like, oh, but that's a conscious decision. I believe it'll attract a certain person, and it'll build a better company with people more bought into it. So we're running a similar. We have the same approach.
Yeah. Well, and if you look at the bottom line, what is your employee churn rate? So I know when I've talked to companies, and this is I think more typical in the West Coast, where there's higher salary, there's higher competition for employees, like in Austin and LA and San Francisco. I would go there and I'd talk to companies, and they would have people every year. You would churn out 10-20% of your company. I mean, people would be at each job for maybe 1 or 2 years, and no one was ever there for longer. And some of these companies we work with, we'd have a customer success manager that would change every year because they left. We have almost no turnover at the company.
Same.
I think voluntarily, one person's left voluntarily in 15 years.
One? Oh, wow.
One.
Okay.
I mean, we have let some people go because they weren't fit, or whatever. But voluntary turnover was one person, so 1 out of 15.
Wow.
Years. So, and I think that's a financial cost, because once you start dealing with people leaving and retraining them, hiring them, that will cost you a lot more than your benefits. That will cost you a lot more than your sick days and days off. It's a fraction.
Of course. All right. So look, this is a podcast about being an expat in America. And one question I always ask everyone is what the American dream means to them. So what does the American dream mean to you?
The American dream to me meant being able to forge my own way and build my own path, not having to do things the way that my parents did them, or that other people were doing them. And when I left university and I came here, I felt the freedom to explore and build something of my own. And now, especially when I compare to my colleagues back in the UK who I grew up with, I really feel I've had that opportunity to do that. So for me, it's just that freedom to make my own mistakes and learn my own lessons, but build my own path.
Good answer. What does the future look like? How would you take this and continue your American dream?
So the future for me, I guess, as opposed to the country or the nation, for me, it's to continue to build the company, live the values that we've espoused, watch my kids also grow up. Both of my kids one's in college, one's finished. I'm curious what their paths will be, having been born here, and compare that with my own. I'm curious to see what they will do. And to me, it's also I founded a family here in America, and as they have kids and grandkids, and we are part of that evolving story and that tapestry here as well.
When you look at your kids now, and I think you kind of touched on this at the outset, they obviously have a very different upbringing, very different experience, different education. I mean, but you went from Swansea to Oxford. That's pretty impressive. Oxford is just a fantastic institution, but you're still in the UK, right? There's still constraints, I imagine there were different. People from very different backgrounds at Oxford.
We had aristocrats who ran the country, and me from a small town. Yes.
Yeah. When you look at your kids, does anything leap out at you? Is it they've just got broader horizons without even thinking about it? Is there anything that leaps out at you as like a? The biggest thing is the first they see themselves as Americans, not as British or European first. They obviously have the other passports too, but I think it was the feeling particularly they both gravitated into science technology fields.
and they felt like they could work anywhere and do anything. They could work, so they could be, when they chose to live in Berlin or live in America, they felt like the whole world was an option, was open to them, and they could be in whatever industry they wanted. And my son was looking at biotechnology and aerospace. My daughter's been looking at AI and augmented reality, and these are fields that are highly expensive, highly innovative, and in America they feel like they can conquer these fields without maybe as much effort as I think someone in Europe would feel, or other parts of the world. I would say that's the difference watching them grow up. It's a little bit more effortless for them. They didn't have to, and I don't mean to dismiss their achievements at all, but there's an easier path, a line of sight for them to say, I want to be to aerospace, I want to work for SpaceX, I want to work for Boeing, I want to work for Northrop Grumman. I can work on any of these programs, and as long as I'm good enough, I'll get that opportunity. If you're growing in parts of Europe, you might be good enough, but you may never get that opportunity. I think that's the difference.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. Yeah, and how many people don't appreciate that? I'm not saying your kids don't. I mean, maybe they do because they have
right,
your,
but the wider people, right?
To our point, just take that for granted. And I think, again, I know I'm flying the flag for expats, but I think, or immigrant, I think we can bring that that fresh perspective, fresh blood to the country.
Elon Musk, good example, right? SpaceX.
Yeah. He's some
He's out
weird
there.
Stuff is going down with Elon right now. Without getting political, I mean, how many times can we say in one show without getting political before someone says you're being political? I wonder what's that. Right. I wonder what our limit is.
I would just say Elon Musk. Well, I love him or hate him, he's out there and he's made a difference. And and there's other people like him, like a lot of the guys in tech. They weren't born in the US. They came here and they made a big impact.
Yeah, I mean, you cannot deny that. Right, Adam, where can people find you?
You can find me most actively on LinkedIn these days. Ironically, I'm not on Twitter as much. And so LinkedIn is the number one place to find me. The company is inflectra.com on our website. And I'm also attend various events around the world. If you're ever in the DC area and you want to chat, please reach out to me. And we're happy to go out for a drink or a pub or something else.
Yeah, especially if you're you went to Oxford Uni.
Well, if you do that, I'm committee vice chair. So come join our alumni group.
Yeah, it sounds great. Right, well, look, Adam, thanks so much for being a guest. It's been great chatting with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Right, we'll see you soon.
Okay, I do have to run. So nice to chat with you.